Nobody had ever used Frostbite to make RPGs, Flynn and Dara found it appealing for a few reasons. It was powerful, for one. DICE had a team of engineers who worked full-time on Frostbite's graphic capabilities, beefing up the visual effects that made, for example, trees sway in the wind. Because this was the video game industry, they also spent a lot of time making it look pretty to blow things up. The other big advantage of Frostbite was that EA owned it. If BioWare started developing all its games on the Frostbite engine, it could share technology with its sister studios, borrowing tools from other EA-owned developers like Visceral, Dead Space, or Criterion Need for Speed, whenever those companies learned cool new tricks for enhancing facial capture or making it look even prettier to blow things up. In the fall of 2010, as the bulk of the Dragon Age team was finishing up DA2, Mark Dara pulled together a small group to work on a prototype they called Blackfoot. This prototype had two major goals: to start getting a feel for the Frostbite engine, and to make a free-to-play multiplayer game set in the Dragon Age universe. The latter never happened, and after a few months, Blackfoot fizzled, hinting at bigger challenges to come. It wasn't making enough progress, ultimately because its team was too small, Dara said. Frostbite's a hard engine to make progress with if your team is too small. It takes a certain number of people to just keep it on. By the end of 2011, with both Blackfoot and the Dragon Age 2 expansion pack cancelled, Dara had a substantial team available to start working on BioWare's next big game. They resurfaced the old Inquisition idea and began to talk about what a Dragon Age 3 might look like on Frostbite. By 2012, they had a plan in place. Dragon Age 3, Inquisition, which later ditched the 3, would be an open-world RPG, inspired heavily by Bethesda's smash hit Skyrim. It would take place all across new areas of Dragon Age's world, and it would hit all the beats that Dragon Age 2 couldn't. My secret mission was to shock and awe the players with the massive amounts of content, said Matt Goldman, the art director. People were complaining, oh, there wasn't enough in Dragon Age 2. Okay, you're not going to say that. At the end of Inquisition, I actually want people to go, oh god, not another level. BioWare wanted Dragon Age Inquisition to be a launch title for the next generation of game consoles, PlayStation 4 and Xbox One. But EA's profit forecasters, caught up in the rise of iPad and iPhone gaming, were worried that the PS4 and Xbox One wouldn't sell very well. As a safeguard, the publisher insisted that they also ship on the older PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360, both of which were already in tens of millions of homes. Most early PS4, Xbox One games followed the same strategy, except for a certain Polish RPG that we'll cover in Chapter 9. With personal computers added to the mix, this meant Inquisition would have to ship on 5 platforms at once, a first for BioWare. Ambitions were piling up. This was to be BioWare's first 3D open-world game and their first game on Frostbite, an engine that had never been used to make RPGs. It needed to be made in roughly 2 years, it needed to ship on 5 platforms, and, oh yeah, it needed to help restore the reputation of a studio that had been beaten up pretty badly. Basically, we had to do new consoles, a new engine, new gameplay, build the hugest game that we've ever made, and build it to a higher standard than we ever did, said Matt Goldman, with tools that don't exist. If an engine is like a car factory, then in 2012, as Inquisition entered development, the Frostbite engine was like a car factory without the proper assembly lines. Before Dragon Age Inquisition, developers at EA had used Frostbite mostly to make first-person shooters like Battlefield and Medal of Honor. Frostbite's engineers had never built tools that would, say, make the main character visible to the player. Why would they need to? In first-person shooters, you see through the character's eyes. Your body consists of disembodied hands, a gun, and, if you're really lucky, some legs. Battlefield didn't need RPG stats, magical spells, or even save systems. The campaign kept track of your progress with automatic checkpoints. As a result, Frostbite couldn't create any of those things. It was an engine that was designed to build shooters, said Dara. We had to build everything on top of it. At first, the Dragon Age team underestimated just how much work this would be. Characters need to move and walk and talk and put on swords, and those swords need to do damage when you swing them. And you need to be able to press a button to swing them, said Mike Laidlaw. Frostbite could do some of that, Laidlaw added, but not all of it. Dara and his team knew that they were the Frostbite guinea pigs, that they were exchanging short-term pain for long-term benefits, but during early development on Dragon Age Inquisition, even the most basic tasks were excruciating. Frostbite didn't yet have the tools they needed to make an RPG. Without those tools in place, a designer had no idea how long it might take to do something as fundamental as making areas. Dragon Age Inquisition was supposed to allow the player to control a party of 4 people, but that system wasn't in the game yet. How could a level designer figure out where to place obstacles on a map if he couldn't test it out with a full party of characters? Even when Frostbite's tools did start functioning, they were finicky and difficult to use. John Epler, a cinematic designer, recalled one internal demo for which he had to go through a Sisyphean ritual just to build a cutscene. I had to get to the conversation in-game, open my tools at the same time, and then as soon as I hit the line, I had to hit the pause button really quickly, Epler said, because otherwise it would just play through to the next line. Then I had to add animations, and then I could scrub it 2 or 3 times before it would crash, and then I'd have to start the process all over again. It was absolutely the worst tools experience I've ever had. The Frostbite team at DICE spent time supporting Epler and the other designers, answering their questions and fixing bugs, but their resources were limited. It didn't help that Sweden was 8 hours ahead of Edmonton. If one of BioWare's designers had a question for DICE in the afternoon, it could take a full day before they heard an answer. Since creating new content in Frostbite was so difficult, trying to evaluate its quality became impossible. At one point, Patrick Weeks, a writer, had finished a scene between several characters and inserted it into the game. He then took it to some of BioWare's leads for one of their standard quality reviews. When they turned on the game, they discovered that only the main character could talk. The engine would not hook up the non-player character lines, Weeks said. You would say something, and then it would go blip, 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 and then you would say something again, and you'd go, okay, I don't know if I can judge the level of quality without any of the words that happen. Engine updates made this process even more challenging. Every time the Frostbite team updated the engine with new fixes and features, BioWare's programmers would have to merge it with the changes they made to the previous version. They'd have to go through the new code and copy-paste all the older stuff they'd built, inventory, save files, characters, then test it all out to ensure they hadn't broken anything. They couldn't find a way to automate the process, so they had to do it manually. It was debilitating, said Cameron Lee. There'd be times when the build wouldn't work for a month, or it was unstable as hell. Because the new version of the engine would come in, the tools team would start doing the integration. All the while, the team is still working and moving ahead, so it gets worse and worse and worse. The art department, meanwhile, was having a blast. For all its weaknesses as an RPG engine, Frostbite was the perfect tool for creating big, gorgeous environments, and the studio's artists took advantage to build out the dense forests and murky swamps that would populate Dragon Age Inquisition. Under Matt Goldman's shock and awe approach, BioWare's environment artists spent months making as much as possible, taking educated guesses when they didn't yet know what the designers needed. The environment art came together quicker than any other aspect of the game, said the lead environment artist Ben McGrath. For a long time there was a joke on the project that we'd made a fantastic looking screenshot generator, because you could walk around these levels with nothing to do. You could take great pictures. Great pictures didn't make for much of a video game, though. Mike Laidlaw, who headed the story and gameplay teams, had been working with the writers and designers to come up with basic beats for Dragon Age Inquisition. Sketching out the story wasn't too hard. They knew the player would organize and lead an inquisition of like-minded soldiers. They knew the big bad would be a demonic wizard named Corypheus. And they knew that, as always, there would be a crew of companions that the player could recruit and seduce. But the concept of Dragon Age Inquisition as an open-world game was stymieing Laidlaw and his team. The art team had constructed all these sprawling landscapes, but what were players going to do there? One idea that BioWare never quite took seriously, rideable dragons. EA's CEO John Riccitiello told us we should have the ability to ride dragons, said Mark Dara. That would make it sell 10 million copies. Dragon Age Inquisition did not have rideable dragons. And how could BioWare ensure that Inquisition's giant world remained fun to explore after dozens of hours? In an ideal world, a big project like Dragon Age Inquisition would have a dedicated team of system designers who were solely responsible for solving those problems. They'd devise quests, activities, and all the other encounters that could keep players entertained while exploring Inquisition's massive world. They'd try to envision what designers call the core gameplay loop. What does a 30-minute play session look like? And then they'd keep prototyping and iterating until that gameplay felt good. In the real world, Laidlaw and his team didn't have time for that. Frostbite wouldn't allow it. As they plugged away at the game, Inquisition's designers found that they couldn't test out new ideas because so many basic features were missing. Was there enough stuff to do in each area of the game? The camera wasn't working, so they couldn't tell. Were the quests interesting enough? They couldn't answer that yet because their combat system didn't exist. Laidlaw and crew came up with the abstract idea that the player, as the Inquisitor, would roam the world solving problems and building some level of power or influence that he or she could then use to affect events on a global scale. Yet for a very long time it remained unclear how that would look in the game. The team played around with the idea of influence as a currency, like gold, but that system didn't seem to click. It really could have used more small-scale refinement and testing, and let's try 3 different ways of doing this, Laidlaw said. Instead, we said, let's build some levels and let's hope we can figure this out as we go. One day in late 2012, after a year of strained development on Inquisition, Mark Darrah asked Mike Laidlaw to go to lunch. We're walking out to his car, Laidlaw said, and I think he might have had a bit of a script in his head. Darrah said, all right, I don't actually know how to approach this, so I'm just going to say it. On a scale of 1 to apocalyptic, how upset would you be if I said the player could be, I don't know, a Qunari Inquisitor? Laidlaw was baffled. They decided that the player could be only a human in Inquisition. Adding other playable races like the Horned Qunari that Darrah was asking for would mean they'd need to quadruple their budget for animation, voice acting, and scripting. I think we could make that work, Laidlaw said, asking Darrah if he could have more budget for dialogue. Darrah answered that if Laidlaw could make playable races happen, he couldn't just have more dialogue. He could have an entire extra year of production. Laidlaw was thrilled. Fuck, yeah, okay, he recalled saying. As it turned out, Mark Darrah had already determined that it would be impossible to finish Dragon Age Inquisition in 2013. The game was too big, and they had underestimated the length of too many tasks because of their frostbite issues. To make Inquisition as good an open-world RPG as Darrah and his crew imagined it could be, they'd have to delay it at least another year. Darrah was in the process of putting together a pitch for EA. Let BioWare delay the game, and in exchange, it'd be even bigger and better than anyone at EA had envisioned. Sitting in a second-floor conference room overlooking the hotel promenade that shared a building with BioWare, Darrah and his leads hashed out an outline of new marketing points that included mounts, a sleek new tactical camera, and the big one, playable races. They put together what they called peelable scope proposals. Here was what they could do with an extra month. Here was what they could do with 6 more months. Here was what they could do with a year. And worst case scenario, here were all the things they'd have to cut if EA wouldn't let them delay Dragon Age Inquisition at all. One day in March 2013, Mark Darrah and BioWare studio boss Aaron Flynn took an early flight to the EA offices in Redwood Shores, California. They were confident that EA would give them some leeway, but it was still nerve-wracking, especially in the wake of EA's recent turmoil. The publisher had just parted ways with its CEO, John Riccitiello, and had recruited a board member, Larry Probst, to keep the seat warm while it hunted for a new top executive. It was impossible to know how Probst would react to BioWare's request. Delaying Dragon Age Inquisition would affect EA's financial projections for that fiscal year, which was never good news. Ever wondered why so many big video games come out in March? There's an easy answer for that. The fiscal year used for reporting financial performance to stockholders, which dominates the decision-making of every publicly traded company. Most game publishers end their fiscal years on March 31st, so if they're looking to delay a game but still fit it in the current fiscal year, March makes for the perfect window. Darrah and Flynn arrived at EA's headquarters first thing in the morning. As they walked in, the first person they saw was their new boss, Larry Probst. We walked in with Larry, and then we ended up leaving at the end of the day with him as well, which I think made a good impression on him, Darrah said. The meeting lasted around 2 hours. You're talking over scenarios, you're talking over impact on finances, Darrah said. There's some yelling. Maybe it was a convincing pitch, or maybe it was the executive turmoil. Maybe the specter of Dragon Age 2 had an effect on Probst and crew, or maybe it was that EA didn't like being called the worst company in America. An internet poll wasn't exactly causing EA stock to plummet, but winning the Consumerist Award 2 years in a row had made a tangible impact on the publisher's executives, leading to some feisty internal meetings about how EA could repair its image. Whatever the reasons, EA greenlit the delay. Moving Dragon Age Inquisition back a year might hurt Q3 earnings, but if it led to a better game, that would be a win for everyone. I first saw Dragon Age Inquisition in a lavish suite at the Grand Hyatt Hotel in downtown Seattle. It was August 2013, and the next day BioWare planned to show the game to fans at the Penny Arcade Expo, PAX, next door, so the studio had invited journalists to get a preemptive peek. Sipping from a complimentary water bottle, I watched Mark Darrah and Mike Laidlaw play through a beautiful 30-minute demo set across 2 war-torn regions, called Crestwood and the Western Approach. In the demo, the player-controlled Inquisitor would rush to defend a keep from invading forces, burn down boats to prevent enemy soldiers from escaping, and capture a fortress for the Inquisition. It all looked fantastic. None of it made it into Dragon Age Inquisition. That demo, like many of the sizzling trailers we see at shows like E3, was almost entirely fake. By the fall of 2013, the Dragon Age team had implemented many of Frostbite's parts, the tires, the axles, the gears, but they still didn't know what kind of car they were making. Laidlaw and crew had scripted the PAX demo by hand, entirely based on what BioWare thought might be in the game. Most of the levels and art assets were real, but the gameplay was not. I did not have that benefit of rock-solid prototypes, said Laidlaw. Part of what we had to do is go out early and try to be transparent because of Dragon Age 2, and just say, look here, it's the game, it's running live, it's at PAX. Because we wanted to make that statement that we're here for fans. Dragon Age 2 hung on the team like a shadow, haunting Laidlaw and other leads as they tried to figure out which gameplay mechanics would work best for Inquisition. Even after the PAX showing, they had trouble sticking to one vision. There was insecurity. I think that's a function of coming out of a rough spell, said Laidlaw. Which of the things that were called out on Dragon Age 2 were a product of time, and which were just a bad call? Which things should we reinvent because we have an opportunity moving into this? It leads to a ton of uncertainty. There were debates over combat. Should they iterate on the fast-paced action of Dragon Age 2, or go back to the tactical focus of Origins? And many arguments over how to populate the local. In the months after PAX 2013, the BioWare team ditched much of what they'd shown during that demo, boat burning and keep capturing. For years, video game developers have struggled with the question of what to put in demos. Is it lying to fans if an E3 feature never makes it into the final game? It's a nuanced topic. When people get really mad, well, you showed this and the final game wasn't like this, said Mark Darrah. We think, well, it was supposed to be, or we thought it was going to be. Even small features like the search tool went through dozens of permutations. Because Dragon Age Inquisition didn't have a proper pre-production phase, which the designers could fool around with prototypes and discard the ones that didn't work, Laidlaw found himself stretched thin. He had to make impulsive decisions. I'm sure depending on who you ask, there are members of my team who would say, wow, I think we did a good job in a rough situation, said Laidlaw. And others who would say, that Mike guy is a giant asshole. Previous BioWare games had been big, but none were as massive as this. By the end of 2013, the Dragon Age Inquisition team comprised more than 200 people, with dozens of additional outsourced artists in Russia and China. Every department had its own leads, but nobody worked in a vacuum. If a writer wanted to pen a scene about 2 dragons fighting, she would have to take it to the design team for a layout, then to the art team for modeling, and then to the cinematics team to make sure the cameras all pointed at the right places. They needed animation, otherwise the 2 dragons would just stand there staring at one another. Then there was audio, visual effects, and quality assurance. Coordinating all this work was a full-time job for several people. It was a real challenge to get everyone working in the same direction, said Shane Hawker, the lead character artist. I think to get more specific on the complexities of this scale of game development, it's the dependencies, said Aaron Flynn. It's the things that have to happen for the other things to work and be successful. The common term in game development circles is blocking, which describes when a developer can't get work done because he or she is waiting for someone else to send over some integral art asset or piece of code. Okay, well, I was going to do this today, but I can't because we have a crash, so I'm going to go to this other thing, said Flynn. Good developers are constantly juggling these little tasks on a daily level. Blocking was always an issue, but as engineers at both BioWare and DICE added more and more features to Frostbite, work on Dragon Age Inquisition became significantly less tedious. Tools started functioning properly, levels began to shape up. People on the Dragon Age team who had been slowed down by Frostbite before, such as the systems designers, were finally able to implement and test ideas in the open world. They were running out of time, though, and another delay was off the table. Every year at Christmas, each team at BioWare would send out a build of its game for the entire studio to play over the holiday break. Whichever game was closest to release became top priority, and over Christmas 2013, that game was Dragon Age Inquisition. Darrah and his team spent long hours in November and December piecing together a playable version of the game. It didn't need to be perfect or polished. After all, nobody outside EA would see it. But Dara saw it as an opportunity to size things up. This year's build would be narrative playable. People could play through the whole story, but big chunks were missing. And sometimes instead of a new quest, the game would just display big text boxes that described what was supposed to happen. When the rest of BioWare had played the demo and came back to the Dragon Age team with their feedback, Dara realized that they were in trouble. There were big complaints about the story. Some of the feedback was that the game didn't really make a lot of sense and the motivations for the player weren't very logical, said Cameron Lee. At the beginning of Inquisition, a massive explosion would tear a hole in the veil, a magical border that separated the real world from the dreamlike Fade. In Dragon Age lore, this was bad news. The original version of Inquisition's story allowed the player to close this rift and officially take the mantle of Inquisitor during the prologue, which was causing some hang-ups. It didn't do the story help, said Lee, because you've closed the rift, so what's the urgency to keep going? The writers knew that fixing this problem would add extra hours to everyone's days, but what else could they do? Embarking on a mission that they called Operation Sledgehammer, the writers revised the entire first act of Dragon Age Inquisition, adding and tweaking scenes so that the player would have to go out and recruit aid from one of the game's warrior factions, the Mages or Templar, before closing the rift and becoming the Inquisitor. Sledgehammer didn't destroy the story entirely, it just meant that you had to break some bones in order to reset them in the right kind of way, said Lee. This happens very often in game development. The other big piece of negative feedback from the holiday build was that the battles just weren't fun. In January 2014, in hopes of solving this problem, Daniel Kading, BioWare's lead encounter designer, began an experiment. Kading had recently joined the company after 12 years at Relic, a Vancouver-based studio best known for strategy games like Dawn of War, and he brought with him a rigorous new method for testing combat in video games. Kading went to BioWare's leadership with a proposal. Give him the authority to call up the entire Inquisition team once a week for an hour, 4 weeks in a row, for mandatory play sessions. The lead said yes. So Kading opened his own little laboratory, working with the other designers to construct a set of combat encounters that the rest of the team could test out. Because Dragon Age's battles were comprised of so many factors, player abilities, stats, monster strength, positioning, and so on, Kading saw his experiment as an opportunity to pinpoint where the problems were. After each session, the testers would have to fill out surveys about their experiences. Whereas the holiday build had been wide-ranging, this was laser-focused. When surveys came back during the first week of Kading's experiment, the average rating was a dismal 1.2 out of 10. Somehow that was comforting to the Inquisition gameplay team. Morale took an astonishing turn for the better that very week, Kading said. It's not that we could recognize the problems, it was that we weren't shirking from them. Over the next week, Kading and his team made several small tweaks to combat abilities, boosting cooldowns and changing animation speeds based on the feedback they'd received. The individual responses came through in fits and starts, Kading said. Winter's Grasp is much better now that it's a 4-second freeze instead of a 2-second freeze. This encounter was so much cooler now that I could wall off the behemoth reliably. 4 weeks later, when Kading's experiment had finished, the average rating was an 8.8. As 2014 went on, the Dragon Age Inquisition team made significant progress, although many of them wished they didn't have to ship on those clunky old consoles. The PS4 and Xbox One were both significantly more powerful than their predecessors, particularly when it came to system memory, RAM, which is what allows a game to keep track of everything happening on screen. Confusingly, we also refer to the amount of space on a hard drive as memory, because computers like to make everything more complicated than it needs to be. The PS3 and Xbox 360, which were running on graphics technology from 2004 and 2005, just weren't doing the job. A console's RAM is sort of like a bucket. Displaying characters, objects, and scripts in a game is like adding varying amounts of water to the bucket. And if you overfill it, your game will slow to a crawl or even crash. The PS4's and Xbox One's buckets were nearly 16 times as big as those of the PS3 and Xbox 360. But early on, Dara and Laidlaw had decided not to add features to the next-gen versions that wouldn't be possible on the last-gen versions. They didn't want playing Inquisition on the PS3 and 360 to feel like playing a different game. That limited how much water they could put into their bucket, which meant the team had to find creative solutions. A lot of what we do is well-intentioned fakery, said Patrick Weeks, pointing to a late quest called Here Lies the Abyss. When you assault the fortress, you have a big cutscene that has a lot of Inquisition soldiers and a lot of Grey Wardens on the walls. And then anyone paying attention or looking for it as you're fighting through the fortress will go, wow, I'm only actually fighting 3 to 4 guys at a time, and there are almost never any Inquisition soldiers with me. Because in order for that to actually work on the PS3 and Xbox 360, you couldn't have too many different character types on the screen. I probably should have tried harder to kill the last-gen version of the game, said Aaron Flynn. It turned out that the safety net of older consoles wasn't even necessary. EA and other big publishers had severely underestimated how successful the PS4 and Xbox One would be. Both new consoles sold gangbusters in 2013 and 2014, and the last-gen versions of Inquisition wound up composing just 10% of the game's sales, according to Mark Darrah. Though the Dragon Age team was making progress, and they'd all become more comfortable with Frostbite, parts of the game were still way behind schedule. Because the tools had started functioning so late in the process, and because Inquisition was such a massive, complicated game, the team wasn't able to implement some basic features until the very last minute. We were 8 months from ship before we could get all of the party members in the party, said Patrick Weeks, who was trying to playtest the much-loved companion Iron Bull, when he realized there was no way to recruit Iron Bull. I went, wait, we're 8 months from ship, and no one in the world has ever played the game with Iron Bull in their party? So I have no idea if any line where he's supposed to say something, any line of banter, no idea if any of that is actually firing right. And it wasn't laziness on anyone's part, it's just reality. You're trying to make an engine. All of the programmers and scripters are at the time literally building the world. Because everything was so far behind, the Dragon Age team could identify only some of Inquisition's flaws during the last few months of development. Trying to determine the game's flow and pacing before that period was like trying to test drive a car with 3 wheels. You write the story and you do a review and you go, okay, we'll change some things, said Mark Darrah. And then you put it in and you do a white box. A white box is an outline of a game's level without any art assets attached, used for quick testing and prototypes. At some studios it's called a gray box, at others it's called a black box. That even a concept as simple as this has no standardized name says a great deal about the youth of the video game industry. You're running around a level and it's okay, and then you get the voice acting in and you go, actually this doesn't work, it's totally terrible. Time was running out, and BioWare couldn't delay Inquisition another year. They needed to deliver this game in the fall of 2014. This left Darrah and his team with 2 options. Option 1 was to settle for an incomplete game full of rough drafts and untested ideas. In a post-DA2 world, that wasn't an appealing thought. They couldn't disappoint fans again. They needed to take the time to revise and polish every aspect of Inquisition. I think Dragon Age Inquisition is a direct response to Dragon Age 2, said Cameron Lee. Inquisition was bigger than it needed to be. It had everything but the kitchen sink in it, to the point where we went too far. I think that having to deal with Dragon Age 2 and the negative feedback we got on some parts of that was driving the team to want to put everything in and try to address every little problem or perceived problem. The other option was to crunch. The Dragon Age team had gone through various periods of extended overtime during Inquisition's development, but this would be the worst yet. It would mean months of never-ending late nights and weekends in the office. It would lead to, as Shane Hawko put it, a lot of lost family time. I would love to have no crunch ever, said Aaron Flynn. I think it remains to be seen whether crunching actually works. Obviously, a ton of literature says it doesn't. But I think everybody finds a time in their development careers where you're going, I don't see what options we have. John Epler, the cinematic designer, recalled a bleary-eyed ritual in which every night he'd drive to the same convenience store, pick up a bag of Cheetos, and then go home and zone out in front of the television. You get to the point where you've been at work for 12 or 14 hours, you get on the road home and you think, all I really want to do is watch a TV show I've watched 100 times and eat junk food I've eaten 100 times, because those things are comfortable. I know how they're going to end, Epler said. Whereas every day is another something coming to the top of the pile and, oh shit, somebody needs to look at this. When the store's clerks started to recognize him, Epler realized he needed a lifestyle adjustment. As they crunched through 2014, Darrah and crew finally finished off the features they wished they'd been able to nail down back in the first year of development. They completed the power system, which would allow the players to build up influence for the Inquisition by roaming around the world and solving problems. They filled Inquisition's deserts and swamps with side quests, hidden treasures, and astrological puzzles. Ideas that weren't working, like reactive environments, destroyable ladders, mud that sticks to your shoes, were promptly removed. The writers blew up and rewrote the prologue at least 6 times, by one producer's count, although they didn't have time to give nearly as much attention to the ending. Just a few months before the game shipped, they added some features that would turn out to be pivotal, like a jump button that would let the Inquisitor hop over fences and gradually scale mountains, through the time-tested video game tradition of leaping against the side of a mountain over and over until you make it up.
No.
The team had originally scheduled Inquisition for October, but by the summer they'd bumped it back another 6 weeks for what game developers call polish, the phase of development in which a game's content and features are complete and all that remains is optimization and bug fixing. Dragon Age Inquisition had about 99,000 bugs on it, said Mark Darrah. That's the actual number. That requires a lot of context because we file qualitative and quantitative bugs, so things like, oh, I was kind of bored at this point, that's a bug. The number of bugs on an open-world game, I've never seen anything like it, said Ben McGrath, the lead environment artist. But they're also easy to fix, so keep filing those bugs and we'll keep fixing them. For BioWare, it was far harder to discover them all. It required creative experimentation from the quality assurance, QA team, who spent what felt like endless late nights testing everything from the intricacies of the crafting system to whether you could jump off the edge of a mountain and fall through the environment. During those last few months, the writer Patrick Weeks would take builds of Inquisition home and let his 9-year-old son play around with the game. His son was obsessed with mounting and dismounting the horse, which Weeks found amusing. One night, Weeks' son came up and said he'd been killed by a bunch of spiders, which seemed strange. His son's characters were too high a level to be dying to spiders. Confused, Weeks loaded up the game and, sure enough, a group of spiders had annihilated his son's party. After some poking around, Weeks figured out the problem. If you dismounted the horse in the wrong place, all your companion's gear would disappear. It was because my son liked the horse so much more than anyone else had ever or will ever like the horse, Weeks said. I doubt we would have seen it because it takes spamming the button to figure out there's a 1 in 1,000 chance that if you're in the right place, it's going to wipe out your party members. Mark Darrah, who was responsible for steering the Dragon Age Inquisition pirate ship into its final port, had a knack for knowing which bugs were worth fixing, like the one where you could jump on your dwarf party member's head to get to areas that shouldn't be accessible, and which weren't, like the ones where your weapon's graphic would clip through walls. On an open-world RPG of this scope and scale, it would be impractical and take way too much time to fix every possible bug, so they had to prioritize. It helped that the Dragon Age team was full of veterans, and that over the years they developed a fair amount of chemistry as a team. Muscle memory is incredibly influential at this point, said Cameron Lee. Through the hellfire which is game development, we're forged into a unit, and that we know what everyone's thinking, and we understand everyone's expectations, and we know what needs to get done, and just do it. Eventually, they did it. On November 18th, 2014, BioWare launched Dragon Age Inquisition, successfully shipping the game despite Frostbite's many challenges. I think at launch we still didn't actually have all our tools working, said Mark Darrah. We had our tools working enough. Almost immediately, Inquisition became the best-selling Dragon Age game, beating EA sales expectations in just a few weeks. The combat was fun, occasionally too chaotic. The environments were beautiful, and the companions were fantastic, thanks to top-notch writing and voice acting, including a breakout performance by the former Team Heartthrob Freddie Prinze Jr. as Iron Bull. One standout scene, which unfolded right after the player's home base was destroyed, depicted the tattered remnants of the Inquisitor's army, singing a hopeful song in unison. Dawn will come. Dragon Age Inquisition was, in many ways, a triumphant game. Look closely enough, however, and you can find lingering remnants of Inquisition's chaotic development. One of the first things you'd see in the game was an area called the Hinterlands, a quilt of forests and farms that served as Dragon Age's first open-world environment. The Hinterlands was full of fetch quests, garbage quests, Darrah called them, that would send you off to deliver herbs and kill throngs of wolves. They were serviceable time wasters, but they felt like chores compared with Inquisition's fascinating main story. The problem was, too many people weren't going out and seeing the main story. Some players didn't realize they could leave the Hinterlands and return to their home base of Haven to trigger the next main story quest. Other players got stuck in a weird, compulsive gratification loop, forcing themselves to do every side quest in the Hinterlands before leaving. One of my more popular Kotaku articles during the week of Dragon Age Inquisition's launch was titled, TSA, if you're playing Dragon Age, leave the Hinterlands. Internet commenters rushed to blame those damn lazy developers for this problem. But really, it was the natural consequence of Inquisition's struggles. Had the Dragon Age team miraculously received another year to make the game, or if they'd had the opportunity to spend years building up Frostbite's tools before starting development, maybe those quests would have been more interesting. Maybe they would have been less tedious. Maybe they'd have had more twists and complications, like the ones found in The Witcher 3 just a few months later. The challenge of the Hinterlands and what it represented to the opening 10 hours of Dragon Age is exactly the struggle of learning to build open-world gameplay and mechanisms when you are a linear narrative story studio, said Aaron Flynn. For BioWare, Dragon Age Inquisition was nonetheless a victory. Aaron Flynn, Mark Darrah, and the rest of the Dragon Age team had succeeded. Dragon Age 2 was the product of a remarkable timeline challenge. Dragon Age Inquisition is the product of a remarkable technical challenge, said Mike Laidlaw. But it had enough time to cook. As a result, it was a much better game. Chapter 7. Shovel Knight. On March 14th, 2013, a group of exhausted game developers sat in a cramped apartment in Valencia, California, surrounded by bulletin boards and IKEA tables. Sean Velasco,
Coño, pero tú me dijiste que para ayudarte a poner esto, lo he puesto todo yo.
Took out a camera and started pointing it around the room, panning across three other tired faces.
No creo que puedas
Nick
hacer nada.
Wozniak, the pixel artist, Ian Flood, a programmer,
¿Para
and
qué
Aaron
sirve?
Pellin, the concept artist. On a call from Chicago was David Deanne,
Come
the second
pingo.
programmer, his head ever present on the laptop above the bookshelf thanks to Google Hangouts. A combination of anxiety and sleep deprivation was making him all jittery. Look, everybody, Velasco said to the camera. We're gonna fucking launch the Kickstarter right now.
Pon eso.
Okay.
¿Cómo tú crees que vamos a honey?
Mira, te voy a poner uno. ¿Dónde está?
Wozniak
Te
pressed
voy a
the button.
poner uno y te voy a enseñar. Mira, esto eres
Confirmed,
tú, ¿eh?
Velasco said. Wozniak pressed the button
Así.
again.
Lo coges con una manito, ¿eh?
Oh my God.
Lo
Velasco
pones
said.
aquí
Okay.
así.
Es al
¿Ves?
revés.
Okay, you guys. All right. Are you ready?
¿Qué sirve para eso?
Get to work.
Bueno, lo viras
The
entonces.
Shovel Knight Kickstarter
Con su
was now
manito,
live,
mira.
asking
Lo
fans for
pones aquí.
$75,000 to make their dream game. Although, unlike Obsidian's Pillars of Eternity, this campaign didn't start skyrocketing right away.
Igual.
Few people were even paying attention.
Lo
It
pones
was
ahí.
definitely nerve-wracking, David D'Angelo said later.
Me había
We
dicho.
spent so much
¡Oye!
time thinking about it and planning for it and investing in it
Ya
in
te
our minds.
enseñé cómo era. Ahora lo haces.
No one notices
Y está. Y
because
está.
there's a Kickstarter at the moment when it launches.
Sí, mi amor, es que no tienes 10 minutos de tu vida, pues tienes tantas cosas que
En
hacer.
serio,
They'd
dale.
quit their jobs
Mi
to
amor,
make
hazlo
this
como lo hice, no jodas.
that enough people
No, es que no te gusta el trabajo, güey.
pay money so this could
Ese
be
es el lío tuyo.
Pero
no
porque
te
tengo
gusta.
que pasar trabajo y ponerlo mal.
¿Pero qué estás haciendo? ¿Qué estás haciendo?
¿Qué estás haciendo tú?
They wanted
Jugando.
to have
Y tú estás... Ah, pero ¿a quién le importa eso ahora? ¿A quién le importa eso?
A mí.
¡A ver! ¡Ya!
Up until a few months earlier, Sean
A lo
Velasco and
mal.
the rest of the team had worked at WayForward, an independent game studio around the corner in Valencia that was best known for cranking out an extraordinary quantity of console games every year. Some were licensed games like Thor, a tie-in to the Marvel movie, and Batman the Brave and the Bold, based on the cartoon of the same name. Others were modern-day successors to NES classics like the action game Contra 4 and the platformer A Boy and His Blob, in which you maneuver a young boy around various obstacles, solving puzzles by feeding magical colored jelly beans to your amoebic assistant. All these games had one thing in common. They didn't take long to make. In other words, they were cheap. WayForward specialized in two-dimensional side-scrolling games that could be developed by teams of 20 to 30 rather than 200 to 300, on schedules that would sometimes span less than a year, exceptionally short for a modern game. With each game, the company would shuffle people around, placing each developer where WayForward needed him or her the most. Sean Velasco disliked this system, arguing that it devalued team chemistry. I think we were strong people. We developed strong games, Velasco thought. So they thought, well, if we take this guy and put him here, and this other guy put him here, then they'll be able to seed knowledge to everyone else. After working on successful side-scrollers like Blood Rain Betrayal with the same core group of developers, Velasco wanted to stick with his buddies. I always use the analogy of the Star Wars R2 unit, Velasco said. Luke doesn't wipe R2, and so they work really well and really closely together. At WayForward, they would wipe the R2 unit every time, so you never got a chance to really get that level of cohesion. WayForward was a work-for-hire studio, one that could survive only by juggling lots of contracts and making licensed games on very tight deadlines. Recalled Ian Flood of their creative process, it's like, that's really cool that you think that's what Batman should do. But you know what Batman really needs to do? Be out by Christmas. Keeping teams together wasn't the studio's priority, and in 2012, after they finished the brawler game Double Dragon Neon, WayForward's leadership split up Sean Velasco, Ian Flood, Nick Wozniak, and David D'Angelo, moving them all to different projects. Upset that they were no longer together, the group started meeting up outside work. On nights and weekends, they'd all go to Velasco's apartment and experiment with side projects, including a smartphone game that didn't get very far. None of them were really into the touchscreen. They preferred the tactile feel of proper buttons, and it wasn't the type of game they wanted to develop. What they really wanted was to work together on a proper platformer, one that you could play on Nintendo consoles like the 3DS and Wii U. I remember saying, I got into the industry to make Nintendo games, said D'Angelo. Let's make a Nintendo game. And we all looked at each other, said Velasco. And we said, yeah, that's what we want to do. We all want to make great gameplay-first games. We don't know how to have a touchscreen. We want to make gameplay games that use a controller. Back in the office, Velasco pitched WayForward's leadership on a radical idea. What if he and his team did something new? WayForward had 2 buildings, one of which was currently occupied by the QA department. What if Velasco's team took over that second office and became its own semi-autonomous entity? WayForward's management had been thinking about launching a Kickstarter. What if Velasco's team handled that? What if they came up with something totally original, a Nintendo-style game that they could all be proud of? After a few conversations, WayForward's management said no. It just wasn't how the studio operated. Moving people around helped the company crank out games more quickly. Working at WayForward, you have that mentality of it's a work-for-hire place, said Nick Wozniak. They have to fulfill the obligations to the publisher first, at the expense of everything else. During lunch one day at Dink's Deli, a restaurant near their office, Velasco started talking to Flood and Wozniak about what their dream Nintendo game would look like. It would be a 2D game, they decided, both because that would be cheaper than 3D and because it was what they all had experience making. It would look and feel like an NES game, minus the imprecise jumps and frustrating glitches that we saw so often during the 1980s. What Velasco and his friends really wanted was a game that felt like what people remembered about NES games, rose-colored glasses and all. There would have to be a single core mechanic in their game, and the move that seemed most appealing was the down thrust from Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link. With this ability, Link could leap in the air and then stab toward the ground, destroying any enemies and obstacles in his path. The down thrust just seemed like such a fun, versatile move, said Velasco. You can use it to break blocks, you can use it to bounce on things, you can use it to flip enemies over. Someone suggested that the main weapon should be a shovel. Someone else asked, what if it was a knight? They all tried to picture it. A heavily armored knight roaming the countryside and fighting off monsters with his big shovel. He could stab spiders with horizontal pokes or jump up and use his shovel like a pogo stick, hopping on bubbles, ghosts, and big piles of dirt. The image made all 3 of them laugh, and soon enough they'd agreed on both their game and their main character, who would share a name, Shovel Knight. It felt sufficiently iconic, like it could be slapped on t-shirts and lunchboxes. As Velasco, Flood, and Wozniak sat there in the booth of the restaurant, batting ideas back and forth, they devised an entire structure for their game. Shovel Knight would battle against 8 other knights, each with its own distinct theme, as in the old Mega Man games, in which the eponymous hero took on robot bosses with names like Crash Man and Metal Man. Shovel Knight wouldn't absorb his opponent's powers,
Lo puse arriba,
not
creo.
rip off Mega Man that much, but each boss would have his own themed stage. Polar Knight would live in a frozen ship. King Knight would rule over a grand castle. Our hero, Shovel Knight, would conquer them all. That was it, Velasco said. He'll fight these 8 guys, and each one will be cool. They'll have these unique silhouettes, and then we'll have a big bad that you fight at the end. We just started from there. Knowing that WayForward would never let them make Shovel Knight, they all decided to quit, gambling their savings on the game that they knew they had to make. Sean Velasco and Ian Flood filed resignation letters. Although the departure wasn't exactly amicable for some of them, the crew maintained a good relationship with WayForward over the years. WayForward was so good to us, said Sean Velasco. They lent us their tech and they helped us with references, and we see them all the time at all the trade shows and industry events. I worked with them for 7 years. They're great friends and they're good people, and there's no way Yacht Club could have existed or that I would exist as a designer without all the things I've learned at that place. David D'Angelo, who had moved to Chicago while his fiancée attended graduate school, kept working at WayForward remotely but planned to moonlight on Shovel Knight and then eventually switch over full-time. Nick Wozniak wanted to stay at WayForward and save up more money before joining the new venture, but when WayForward's leadership found out he was planning to leave, they fired him. Recalled Wozniak, "They said, 'You're gonna leave, right?' And I said, 'Well, eventually, yeah.' And they said, 'Why don't you just make today your last day?'" It was a tradition for departing WayForward employees to gather at the nearby Red Robin. Not that we liked Red Robin, said Wozniak. It was just a thing that was terrible that we did. And after finding out he'd lost his job, Wozniak called everyone for an impromptu trip there, including his wife. What nobody else knew was that Wozniak's wife was 8 weeks pregnant, and that the main reason he wanted to stay at WayForward was to save up money for the new kid. She was freaking out, Wozniak said. She was very nervous. By January 2013, they were all in on Shovel Knight, which was exhilarating yet terrifying. They were elated to be working on their dream game, but they knew they'd be working on it for at least a year before they started to make any money. Getting funding from investors or publishers seemed like a bad idea. A publisher would demand creative control, and worse, a publisher would oversee marketing. Velasco and crew had a specific vision for Shovel Knight as a brand, one that they wouldn't want to trust with a big publisher that was looking for profit above all else. The only real option was crowdfunding, not just to earn money for their game, but to start building a base of loyal fans. We thought Kickstarter is probably the best way we can grow a community that is behind the game the whole way through, said David D'Angelo. And so, like Obsidian and so many other independent studios, the Shovel Knight crew went to Kickstarter. For the next 2 months, they started preparing for the Kickstarter,